Welcome to Entromy's Private Equity Impact Series, where we bring you real stories from the field that showcase how data, insight, and advisory experience converge to accelerate value creation with some of the largest private equity firms in the world. Today's guest brings a unique perspective. While he now advises companies as a consultant, he previously sat in the CHRO chair of a portfolio company that chose Entromy to support a major transformation. We'll hear how Entromy's data shaped some of those decisions, influenced leadership conversations, and ultimately impacted the business. Scott, it's great to have you on our podcast here. I'd love to dive into this case study.
Thank you, Matt. Great to see you.
So I'm curious if you could maybe help us get started with thinking about the case study. Was there a single moment where Entromy serviced an insight that kind of shifted how you thought about strengthening execution and maybe even scaling talent within the business?
Yes, this particular example, we were in a business that was scaling extremely rapidly. And so the ability to sustain the pace that we were on and keep everyone focused on what needed to be done was essential. We had zero slack in the system and we were hiring as fast as we could. Entromy helped to highlight a few things that were really important for us and frankly, risk factors of us being able to sustain the kind of pace that we had. One was literally just the level of fatigue that people were experiencing and how they were beginning to express that in their words and in their actions. That was something we needed to understand better and try to intervene to support. Secondly, was with respect to their understanding about compensation. The value creation opportunity for them was tremendous, but not all employees were understanding that. Not all employees were understanding how decisions were made about their pay or about what the potential was with the equity. That was a huge opportunity for us to bolster employee understanding. And lastly, I would maybe say the ability to talk publicly and candidly and transparently about topics that were viewed as sensitive. For whatever reasons, you know how it is in organization, sometimes some topics are perceived as being sensitive, even if they're really important to talk about and they're best dealt with internally. Being able to highlight the data around that for management and employees and lift the veil on those things that needed to be discussed publicly was very constructive.
So I'm hoping that you could give us maybe a little bit of background, help us set the stage here for maybe the broader case study. What was going on in the business when Entromy arrived? And then how did Entromy maybe influence some of those decisions?
Yeah, this again was a business that was expanding very rapidly and succeeding with customers and growing very, very rapidly. And so as chief people officer, what you do in your business, you're waking up every day and you're thinking about, in light of our strategy, in light of this organizational context, how can I help things go faster and better and do so in a way that's going to be sustainable over time and scalable so that when we're twice as big, 4 times as big, 10 times as big, it's still going to work. It's easy to solve for the moment. It's easy to solve for today's scale. It's much more difficult to both solve for the moment and to do something that's going to be sustainable and carry you forward in the future that you're trying to go towards. What Entromy did was to bring us a framework, a tool that made it very, very easy to capture employee sentiment data on a host of things that were very important to understand better in order to gain the insight of the employee perspective on things that were going to drive or influence execution. When we look at the business through a talent and organizational lens, there's some things that we can measure directly, and there are other things that we are extremely dependent upon employee perception data for. Culture is a great example. You cannot measure culture directly. You cannot go ask the CEO to just culture and then assume that that's reality. Culture exists between the perceptions of everyone in the organization. And the only way to tease that out and really get a feel for it is through that perception data. So being able to tease that out and use Entromy's natural language processing capability to take disparate versions of reality, disparate comments, and make sense of that and boil it down to true business relevant insight that decision makers can align on, can acknowledge and agree to the relevance for the business of, and then ultimately act on. That's powerful. That's what I found to be extremely helpful.
So, Scott, when we're thinking about this business that's scaling rapidly, I tend to think about how important, even maybe more so than in a non-scaling company, but how important time is. You don't get it back. We all are operating under these different constraints, but when you're quickly adding overhead in the form of talent, they really need to be set up for success. And so I'm kind of curious, if you could speak to maybe the speed of these insights, because one of the things that we've heard from other consultants that have used our platform is that ability to know those knowables faster is a complete
Right.
game changer. You don't want to waste 2 quarters of a 5-year hold period. And that's, 10% of your hold period where you kind of are guessing it at sentiments. You'd like to kind of have that sooner rather than later. Was that the case for you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And what a flashback for many of us that have been around our craft for a few years, right? We remember the days of the big heavy surveys that would take a month to send out. Then they'd go into a black box for 3 months. Then you'd get reports to management that would take them months to get through before cascading them down, before finally debating whether they could do anything with them as we got ready for the next annual cycle. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? Entromy is instantaneous. And I think we live in a world today where sentiment data is not an annual event, of course. It's a real-time, ongoing requirement to have intelligence about the health of the organization, about capability, about perceptions, about your engagement level with your workforce. That real-time sentiment data needs to always be available, and to have a platform that you can be using to surface that at regular intervals and immediately serving up and distributing those insights. Extremely valuable. And that indeed was the case that we had at the company I have in mind.
And so when you talk about the level of detail or the clarity that the reports provide, can you compare this maybe to those more manual reports you were just talking about? Maybe even pre AI, people were doing these by hand, but what is the level of clarity that you're able to get now from Entromy's reports?
Yeah, I mean, the Entromy platform is so easy to use and flexible that allows you to drill down and to sort by different factors, that if you're trying to look at employees that have just joined the business within the past 6 months, so you can get a sense for how their experience might be different, how their perceptions might be different, you can cut it this way, you can cut it by all kinds of variables that allow you to drill in and cross compare various slices of the organization to try to understand, where do you have differences in perceptions? Where do you have differences in experience? And where are those relevant to things that could be getting in the way of great execution, or that could be intervention opportunities? Meaning, if those just hired employees are perceiving things a certain way that is not fully informed by the set of facts that could be made available to them, let's have some additional conversation to give those employees more context so that their perceptions can be better informed. Entromy allows that kind of pinpointing of those intervention opportunities.
So, kind of thinking about the same line of thought, Scott, with interventions and really ultimately it's building an action plan. How did Entromy maybe influence the priorities that you saw as a strategic leader? I would assume that you probably had your own presumptions, maybe going into
Right.
this, and then, maybe it was contradictory, maybe it was confirmatory, but could you maybe just describe kind of the influence that it played on your strategic planning?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the challenges with employee perception data is that all of us as leaders have data points in our heads from our many touch points and conversations with employees. And so we're all walking around with perceptions of what are the opportunities, what are the strengths, what are some challenges we need to address. But it isn't oftentimes until you get a quantitative description of that sentiment data that everyone can look at together. And business people, they love numbers. Numbers are the language of business because that allows you to suddenly compare this factor versus that factor. It allows you to benchmark with internal standards. It allows you to compare year over year change or a quarter over quarter change if you've got historical data. And it allows you therefore to look at where do you have some of the greatest opportunity for intervention because your perception data is suggesting that you've got vulnerabilities here. Numbers and get mind share as a leadership team is extremely helpful for creating the circumstances that enable you to move to action next. At the end of the day, that's what matters, right? You got to have the insights, but then you've got to act on them. And until you've got stakeholder alignment about those opportunities and agreement that they're relevant to act on, it's difficult sometimes to get the organizational inertia to really act and follow through to drive change.
Scott, one of the components of our platform is our organizational network analysis. And so we take an active approach to O&A. We ask questions to the employees about specifically who do they go to for things like innovation and strategy and some of these other topics that are very relevant to business. Can you recall maybe how the O&A portion of the platform influenced maybe your preconceived notions about connectivity? Maybe it was a surprise to find that certain departments were more siloed than you had anticipated.
Yeah, exactly. Network analysis has become a hot topic in recent years for good reason. Traditionally, it was assumed that information largely followed the organizational structure and that was the primary way that influence was exerted through the organization. But what the organizational network analysis really helped to unveil is the fact that communication patterns go in all kinds of unpredictable directions. And oftentimes there are very influential seats in the organization that may not be in senior positions necessarily in the reporting hierarchy. It's a really important insight. And you can use that. We've used that in the past. I've used that in various chapters of my career to identify stakeholders that we needed to pull in close and respectfully engage them to leverage their leadership to help influence their peers because their peers have such respect for their opinions.
So, Scott, if you were going to describe Entromy's role as a strategic partner, how would you do that maybe in a couple of sentences?
Sure. There are other providers out there, and some of the providers that I've worked with in the past, they describe their outcomes, their tools as being about optimizing for employee satisfaction, being an employer of choice, driving high employee engagement. For me, what's really unique about Entromy is it is a business outcomes platform. It is about execution, it is about value creation, and it is about business risk identification. That connection between the employee sentiment data and the business outcomes that ultimately are what we're trying to drive was really a distinguishing factor for me in choosing Entromy and wanting to continue to work with Entromy the way I do.
So, Scott, I want to shift gears just a little bit. And I'm just kind of curious, as you've, kind of stepped into this entrepreneurial space, you've taken some of the great skills and things that you've learned, being a CHRO, being at other C-suite levels at different organizations. What do you see as maybe some of those challenges today that are maybe influencing organizations, impacting their ability to scale, and where you really see maybe the future headed when it comes to operations in PE-backed companies?
Well, money is still expensive. So getting to profitability and being efficient is really the name of the game. Everybody's excited about AI and can't stop talking about it. And everyone is hopeful that AI is going to unleash a next wave of productivity that is going to unlock a lot of value for organizations and for customers. Some would argue the jury is still out on that. I think we all recognize we're in early innings. There's a lot of work to do. But one thing we know for sure is it's not that people are going to be replaced by AI completely. We're going to be working alongside of AI. And so the companies that are going to be successful, in my opinion, what I believe, are the ones that are figuring out where is it that the technology can be leveraged to drive the tasks, because the technology can do that better than people. And where are the workload? Here are the tasks that we do not want to outsource to technology that doesn't make sense, because people can do that far better. And therefore, we're going to use the technology to magnify the impact of the people and to complement the skills. Frankly, to serve our customers better and better.
Thinking about your time as a really influential CHRO scaling organizations, what would you say maybe are a couple of things that you've learned about what it truly takes to scale? Because sometimes, honestly, Scott, I hear about organizations wanting to scale. I hear about a scaling objective. People throw around this term scaling quite a bit, but you've done it. You've proven it. You've hired the right people. You've truly seen organizations scale. So what would you say it actually takes in a few maybe bullet points? Because I'm sure there's quite a few details, but what would you say are maybe some of those hallmarks of what it takes to scale an organization?
Yeah, great question. What my experience has been is a few things come to mind. First of all, people are smart and they need to exercise judgment every day. And when you're growing rapidly, they've got to make decisions about how best to align their work and have the biggest impact on the company to further that growth in the way that they think they can and that makes sense to them. The more that you can provide them with context, where are we at? Where are we going? How are we intending to get there? What do we expect of you? How does your work connect with someone else's work? The better able those employees are to do their most impactful work in the service of that growth and to stay connected and in alignment. Because alignment is hard in the best of times, and it gets even more difficult when things are going crazy and you're growing so quickly and you're adding new people, and the new people are trying to figure out, and exercise judgment themselves independently, and they've been with the company for 15 minutes. That's super hard. And so staying connected, having that mind share is a hugely important factor. Secondly, you start to outgrow processes and methodologies and systems that worked in the past, right? The easiest example is probably employee communications. You start as an early stage company and everybody knows everything. Everybody's copied on everything. And everybody feels like they should be copied on everything because it's an egalitarian, inclusive culture and they want to keep that. And then suddenly that makes zero sense because you're so big, you're running so fast, but who gets included in what communication? Who has a vote on what topic? Who has decision rights to be able to decide unilaterally and inform the rest of the company later of things that they're accountable for driving? If you don't bring some kind of clarity and taxonomy to that and just allow your growth to outrun all of today's practices, you are inviting dissatisfaction, frustration, tension in relationships. That's an easy one to kind of anticipate and begin to get some sense from the sentiment data that's bubbling up through a platform like Entromy to then get ahead of and invest the time to get your scaffolding strong and your practices aligned with today's reality so that you can go and grow. And that example could be sort of copy and pasted across a number of different domains with respect to how the organization operates and what its practices are with respect to talent and people management.
So Scott, I want to give you an opportunity, if you don't mind. I think you've been, relatively successful in your role and in your career. There might be this next generation of folks kind of coming into the private equity space, very educated. They did maybe grow up with a little bit of a different affinity for technology than some of the other folks that have been around for a little while. But what would you say maybe are a few pieces of advice that you'd love to pass on to that next generation of up and coming
Yeah, that's a great question because the world is going to be very different in the next 20 years than it's been in the last 20 years, obviously. Again, what I've heard recently, somebody articulated it like this to me. Chief people officers are responsible for the workforce balance sheet. So if the balance sheet is a financial balance sheet, and as we look forward, we know that that is going to include employing both humans and agentic AI, then workforce planning and org design and the way we drive execution takes on a whole new meaning. I lived in an era where suddenly, outsourcing and third parties and multinational companies were a possibility. So that was several new dimensions actually that needed to be configured in the mix of what it meant to plan for your workforce, plan and create the circumstances for great execution. We've just added a new node and a really important node in that equation. And most of us today are, scrambling to keep up and figure out how do we invent this new future? How do we do workforce planning and create organizations that are going to thrive and be healthy with people teaming with AI? People that are now just entering into this space and taking the mantle as heads of HR, they've got a great opportunity to lead some what their experience has been growing up with technology and probably having more time at the laptop with AI than most of us that have been out in the trenches working for the last 2 decades to invent that future and show us new ways of working with AI. So I'm excited to see what some of those up and coming CHROs are going to come up with and the example they'll set for all of us.
Scott, I really appreciate your time today. This has been a really insightful conversation, not only because I think there's a little bit more clarity around maybe some of the capabilities that Entromy can provide, but also when you start to add a subject matter expert to the equation to really interpret and then apply some of those findings, It's been a really rich discussion. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
much.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate the great partnership with Entromy. Thank you.